Resignation versus Re-emergence, hosted by the Association of Change Management Professionals. I'm Alison Hornery, your host for today's session. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting today's conversation from the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to our lands and waters. A few quick housekeeping items for those of you who are joining us before we get underway. Please take the opportunity to introduce yourselves in the chat box and use this space throughout today's webinar to explore ideas and think out loud with your colleagues. We won't be having a Q&A segment in today's discussion, but if you do have any questions for the panel, please share these in the Q&A function, which you will find in your Zoom menu, and the ACMP team will coordinate panel responses and circulate them to you after the session. So in the first of the series, the panel looked at exploring in their discussion as their theme. And today we're taking an expanding frame and inviting you to expand the way you think about your practice. We'll be looking at 4 key dimensions and questions where the panels will be challenging their assumptions and yours about the mindsets, skill sets, and tool sets needed for the future. We're also going to expand our view of what resignation and re-emergence can mean in different contexts. So let's jump in and meet our panel for today. Nicole Locke is an independent change strategist and program manager. Chris Gildersleeve is the principal coach and purposeful change partner at Set to Change. Paul Beaumont is the global workplace advisory lead at Avanade. Michael Kirk is the digital consulting expert and board member for the ACMP East Coast Australia. And we have Peter Cully also joining us from the ACMP. Welcome to you all. Now, Michael is experiencing a few technical issues with us today, so he's going to be engaging with you in the chat and looking at some of the digital dimensions of our conversation. So please do enjoy that. Now, let's start with our first focus area, which is sustainability in multiple dimensions. Now, Paul, if I can turn to you first, we used to think of sustainability as just being about the environment. In your view, is corporate sustainability really just still a sales and leadership buzzword, or are we seeing real action beyond just environmental concerns?
Thanks. I mean, it's a great question. It can seem that these days, no matter what we're talking about in a business context, sentences will end with, and we need to do this in a sustainable manner. I'm not quite sure it's a buzzword. I think if it was a buzzword, there'd be no real substance behind it, and I don't believe that's true. I was doing a little bit of research, and it's interesting that in the US, the majority of board directors think that ESG will receive as much scrutiny as financial reporting in the next 3 years, and almost all of the Standard & Poor's 500 companies are now reporting on sustainability goals. So that would suggest that organizations are taking this seriously, which is great, because we can't rely on governments to do everything, and industry needs to step up. But it's also, there's evidence that operational sustainability can also be a lever or a source of competitive advantage. So if you think about how you might elevate your brand through your sustainability sort of position, how you might attract and retain customers, how you might attract and retain talent, how you might improve your operational efficiency and the effectiveness of your organization. So it's actually important to organizations as well to be operationally sustainable. So it's important, but I guess the question to ask are the goals that organizations are setting themselves correct? Are they the right ones? And how are they performing against those goals? There's plenty of research out there, and the sort of the view is that, I guess, we've got a mixed bag at the moment. And what's interesting is that most leaders believe that they have set appropriate goals, they have appropriate sustainability strategies. But what's interesting about that is that they seem to be that those views don't seem to be shared by employees or other stakeholders. And it's obviously really important that other stakeholders do believe in an organization's sustainability approach in order to go and deliver them. So, for example, you have some organizations that believe they have robust sustainability plans, whereas some of their employees might just see them as being a little bit more superficial or organizations reporting that they're on track against goals, sustainability goals, but actually employees believing that those goals are not realistic. So when we start talking about things like competitive advantage, it's really important that organizations come across as being credible. Any strategy change it's not something that can just be delivered by leadership. It needs the workforce and employees to deliver against it. And if you have a situation where employees don't believe in the credibility of the organization that they work for when it comes to sustainability or anything else, how can you then expect them to deliver against it? And it goes beyond just having a plan. Anyone can come up with a plan, but embedding sustainability in the operations of an organization and changing the way an organization operates actually needs or requires a change in DNA and a change in culture. And that's not something that happens overnight. It's quite significant in terms of transformational or change. So as I mentioned, change in culture could be the change in the way organizations make decisions. It requires both buy-in from broad leadership within an organization and also requires buy-in from those who work in the organization and will be the ones that actually go and then deliver against that change. So I think most organizations still have a huge amount of work to do. I think it's great that they're on the right track. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the Gartner hype cycle, but it feels like we're moving along that sort of hype cycle at the moment. We've gone through the peak of inflated expectations where, sustainability really was a buzzword. And we've sort of then gone back down through this trough of disillusionment where people have really, recognized that this is hard. This needs hard decision making. It needs really robust strategies and plans to implement. And we're now coming up through the slope of enlightenment where people are now actually getting to grips with actually what they need to do. They might not be far down their path, but at least they know the direction in which they need to travel, and plans are starting to be implemented. Even if they might not be, the plans that are bought into by everybody. The other thing I was going to mention is that in order to be able to progress against goals, organizations need ways to be able to measure and manage how they are progressing. And a lot of organizations currently don't appear to have that ability. So again, plenty of work to do, plenty of change. But back to the original question, I don't necessarily think it's I think sustainability is a buzzword, but I don't think it yet has sufficient substance behind it in a way that organizations need it to have, both from an environmental perspective and also from a business and operational perspective.
So Nicole, can I ask you to build on that and thinking about the idea of, the trough of disillusionment and then trending up towards the path to enlightenment, as it were. What do you say to leaders that think that the status quo is enough to be a sustainable organisation?
Thanks, Alison, and good afternoon, everyone. I would first ask leaders, is status quo good enough? I think the world major events have people asking questions about their own purpose, their own values, their values, beliefs, and alignments to their organisation and even to their profession. And I pick up on Paul's comment about organisations being credible. And I think we're in a unique period in a global economy where we have multiple environmental, social, and governance forces shaping very quickly. And when I talk about organisations, I'm talking from everything from multinational to mum and dad companies, and businesses. And I think, we really need to think about sustainability for all people through really two key components: accountability at all levels and collective intelligence and information. I'm going to also draw on that I think the key in this current environment is building on human connections, taking products to customers. And I think for all of us that have been in lockdowns, etc., around the world, the events have changed the way people engage with customers and customers engage with people through work, through services, and through supply chains. And having connections and that collective intelligence and shared accountability and delivering value, I think, is going to create that sustainable organisation. And I'm really adding to what Paul was talking about earlier. I'm just going to go back to the individual at the moment, and I want to introduce the 7 R's into this discussion: reflection, reinvention, reimagine, and re-emergence. And then we've got resilience, rethinking, and resignation. None of these are linear. You could start from lots of different areas. And I want to flow that through a little around what I think a number of people have been through in asking that question around sustainability in their purpose and their values. So, Alison, I'd like to introduce the 7 R's into this discussion. Back to you.
Well, thank you, and that's perfect segue for me to now turn to Chris. And if, given that expanding is our theme for today, and we're expanding the way we think about sustainability, one of the key aspects of a sustainable organisation is its people. What have you observed, Chris, over the last couple of years about sustainability from a work-life balance and a wellbeing perspective? And what has been the workforce response to these trends? You're on mute, Chris.
The phrase of the last 2 years, you're on mute. Look, I would suggest that actually we are emerging, but we're actually emerging from a period of great loneliness. Different places in the world have been through lockdowns. In some parts of the world, people have been locked into their buildings and not allowed to leave, including in Australia. So that's a period of big isolation, and we've seen in our societies also an upstep in mental health challenges over the last 2 years. Now, a lot of that goes back to people's baseline well-being and the role organisations can play in that. Now, some observations. I've worked with coaches across the globe, and many of them have actually found one of the challenges to their own well-being and their work-life balance is that work is at home. They can't escape from work. They're forever tempted by the laptop sitting there chunking away at night. So they leave to go and spend time with their family, then they go back to work. Or they actually don't know when to leave work. I remember a person I was working with in Berlin. She lived alone. She started work at 8 in the morning and she still found herself working at 10 at night because she had nothing else to do. No way of exiting from work. So building upon Nicole's 7 R's, I'd suggest we also need to look at well-being through perspective of what's called PERMA. People being able to have a positive emotional experience. People to be able to be engaged and have solid relationships with people, find meaning and find achievement. And over the last 2 years, that has not been what a lot of people have found. What's been the outcome of that? Well, people are really questioning, how do I balance my work? How am I sustainable? How am I going to be effective moving forward into this new world of hybrid work? Because so many corporations have said, well, you work at home for a few days, you work in the office for a few days. So people are beginning to respond by, well, do I want to go back to the old life, or do I want to stay with the new, or where do I want to be in between? But people are also having to challenge themselves and saying, well, am I feeling competent in this new world? Am I feeling autonomous in this new world? And what are my relationships going to be like, crafting them going forward? I think there's been, and this is something leaders really need to focus on, is how they rebuild social capital in their organisations. How they go and build relationships from individual to individual. How the leaders build relationships to their people in this new world. And how do they go and build the relationship of the individual to the team and the other teams, and also to the organisation's purpose? Because by building those, they actually help people move forward with actually clarity on what they need to be doing, so that clarity can then help them go and balance their work, their life, their relationships, and respond in a different way to this new world, rather than some people saying, I just don't know where to go. And I think so Michael's got a comment there. Yes?
Yes, Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to build on that. And, I think when we look at how organizations are tackling, the impacts of the pandemic. I think a lot of organizations, I wouldn't say most, but many organizations have implemented some sort of well-being policy or set of policies. I think also we need to think a bit more broadly than that. So you think about how employees' sort of values have changed through the pandemic. Organizations need to consider the employee value proposition that they have for their current set of employees, because it might have changed. And if people aren't just feeling not great because their well-being is not great, also if they're working for an organization that no longer has alignment with their values, then that's also a challenge. And we also need to think about the experience that people have while they are working. If they are in a hybrid work scenario, but for example, the technology doesn't work, it's a constant struggle to try and get work done. And over a period of time, that can be quite draining. And it really needs, this is not just an HR issue. Experience for employees is something that is actually impacted by all leaders across the organization, from HR, from the people who own IT, from the way the business operates, et cetera, et cetera. So it's actually quite a broad conversation, and requires a broad set of inputs from a wide range of leaders.
Michael, so Paul, can I just build upon that a bit? You mentioned wellbeing programs, and I have organisations approach me saying, "Can we have a resilience program, please?" And that's about strengthening an individual. The trouble is that we're coming out of a time of isolation, and making a wellbeing an individual accountability, i.e. becoming more resilient, actually moves against creating a workplace of wellbeing. I think we need to look at wellbeing programs in organisations as being a team sport. It's about people connecting and working together, rather than continue to be alone and responsible for looking after themselves. And we're seeing that in society as well. I've been working with groups in Victoria who've been developing wellbeing programs for their businesses, not just for individuals. And Michael's got something there as well on the chat. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah. So what I might do is pick up Michael's comments in the chat and lead us into our next theme, actually, because it's beautifully framed, where Michael has commented that work-life balance in the new remote regime is such a critical point of worker care and well-being. And it's critical that enterprise leadership begins to more effectively measure workplace well-being, with plenty of room for improvement there. So let's then now talk about this issue of shifts in people's work-life relationships, our second theme for today. Now, Nicole, I'm going to ask you to jump in at this point and talk to us a little bit about power dynamics and how those are shifting, particularly some of those shifts we've seen during the pandemic and as we still continue to live with pandemic kind of situation. What have you seen about the idea of a flatter organisation? And what does this mean for leaders and people around ways of working, organisational and cultural structures? What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Alison. I think the key here, and Paul has touched on a lot of these elements as well in his first initial when we talked about sustainability, but the shifts in people's work-life relationships is definitely changed. And I think changed forever with the major events that we've gone through. The times of going to work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, leaving the house, coming back, working within those timeframes, etc. There's something of the 20th century, and now we need to look at how we're moving forward. I think the key thing that we need to look at, and as I introduced the 7 Rs from a people perspective in my first discussion, but that reflection, reinvention, reimagine, and re-emergence is something that we need to look at both at an individual level, at a work-life relationship level, and even the C-suite and the B-suite are looking at it from a change strategy and balancing business, return on investment, stakeholder dividends or shareholder dividends with ensuring that they've got a sustainable organisation. And for that sustainability, those work-life relationships are very important with the staff. And that's the whole ecosystem around your business operations, your ways of working. So I think creating, if we go back to, your organizational structure, it creates the lines of communication and your policies and accountability and responsibility. How do we look at that now in its simplest form across organizations that are virtual, geographic, hybrid, etc.? So I question whether flatter organizations is the only way. And I'm going to question that and say the organizational structure needs to be appropriate for the organization's business, its operating model, its customers, and its people. Flatter organizations, if we look through the theories, talk about elevates the people's level of responsibility. It talks about removing management layers and offering, more generalists. It often produces more generalists rather than specialists. Again, we're questioning all of these theories now since our major events. And I think we need to rethink all of this. And therefore, to me, I struggle with thinking about just a flatter organizational structure. It's got to be tailored for your environment, for the organization's, business and return on investment. But I would throw to Peter Cully, who may wish to talk about this, because it's something that we've talked about regularly around return on investment and shareholder dividends and structures.
Thanks, Nicole. That's great. Oh, sorry, I think my focus would be on the whole area of delivering value and sustainable organizations. There are two hands to shake in a handshake. The organization is definitely one side of it. We're talking a lot about people and people's involvement in their relationship with the organization. The organizations are there to employ those people, to have those conversations. So I'll just for the moment focus on the organizational side, what I'm seeing, that they're looking for a lot more investment around sustainable legacies that they would like to be left from a consulting piece of work that's done with them, whether it comes in the form of an organizational structure change, metrics, other initiatives like learning ecosystems or whatever, but they're looking for something to be left behind. Now that's become much more explicit because the money is not going to be thrown around that easily nowadays. There are maybe lots of jobs out there, but they're not all very highly paid for. There's a lot of competition for organizations to not have to pay a lot of money to have to get all the good people. There's another side of the coin, and we have to look at that. And they're looking at things that we can leave behind that are not just enabling effective transformation, but also a retaining of ROI and benefits ongoing. So they're really thinking value. And I think part of it goes back to some comments made by Jeremy Scrivens in a very first of these sessions that we had, when he talked about minds from the older period, in other words, not the right thinking, trying to normalize the new opportunities that have come with the pandemic and business transformation or digital transformation. So I think the problems that organizations are going to really face is the ability to pivot both their people and their culture, more importantly, quickly and at a faster pace to cope with very much faster changing environments. That's not easy, and it's not going to happen quickly. And that social contract, which will include the thinking around an org culture, the thinking of people, all the people on this panel will be thinking or should be thinking in that area, are the sort of issues that we're going to be facing tomorrow. And that's really one thing I'd really like to put on the table for us to talk about. And in terms of thinking about how we consider people more diligently in that sort of environment, we're looking at, even the introduction of org culture type assessments being done at a program level, not at a organizational wide level, but at a program level, to see how that organization operates within that particular program of work, maybe an SAP implementation or whatever. And on top of that, you might have a mental health assessment that adds to your stakeholder analysis that actually pulls out of that, teases out of that, what's under the hood in terms of mental stress, psychological safety, etc. And these are all areas that are new and should be being added to the raft of tools that we use to better achieve that outcome for the organization. And I think that we stand a hope for organizations to start thinking about pivoting faster in the areas we talked about. But the rules aren't written, and it's a tough game, and it's not an easy solution, and it'll vary by organization, large, small, industry sector, etc. So that's what I probably have to say in that. But thanks, Nicole. That was a great question.
So that's a great segue. And I noticed there's a comment in the chat here that employee experience is the major reason for leaving positions. And Chris, in listening to the conversation so far, I'm tempted to throw an 8th R into Nicole's 7R mix, and that is resourcefulness when thinking about re-emergence, and thinking about what opportunities people have to shape their own future. How have you seen people recrafting their work relationships to cater with these new ways of working?
That's a good question, Nicole. Sorry, Alison. I've seen it happen in various ways. In some organisations, the recrafting has been actually to distance the relationship. It's, we'll talk to you when you're in the office, and when you're not in the office, well, you just keep working, and we'll know if you're working or not by how much time you're online, which is actually adding to the loneliness and actually adding to people feeling like they're effectively just there to do a task. They're not part of a wider journey. Then there are other organisations where the actual leaders have become more focused on scaffolding success. And returning to Nicole's comment concerning about flattening structures. The flatter the structure, the wider the leadership span of control is, and therefore the less time the leader has to actually scaffold the success of the people in their team. So I would challenge leaders to think about, when we're designing an organisation, are we designing an organisation which actually supports our people, not controls them, but supports them to be successful, sets them up for success? Or are we creating an organisation where people don't go and get the resources they need to be successful? Now, some of those resources are not just physical resources, not just the online, the machines. It's actually the relationships. It's actually the real understanding from the leaders of what the challenges they're facing and how those challenges need to be worked through in the new world. I've also seen people, not just leaders, but at all levels in organisations, saying, well, I can't reach out to somebody when we're working remotely because I might interrupt them. Whereas in the old world, they'd go and bump into each other at coffee machines or the water cooler or at lunch. So there was this casual interaction, this building of bonds. So I challenge all organisations which are moving to hybrid work is, what do you need to do when people are in the office to go and help them build relationships which they can then carry outside of the office confidently to be able to interrupt each other outside of the actual formal workplace.
Chris, just add to that just for a moment, Alison. A number of us are working remotely, and I've been working remotely now for a number of months, but I don't feel alone because I sit in a Slack channel in a shared room, and even though the person is not actually sitting right next to me, I'm still sitting with my colleagues, and we're all working, and if we have to ask each other a question, we will. We're on mute, yes, and we jump off mute and ask a question, or we've got music playing. So you still can create that environment of connectedness through different ways. And I think that's really important to think about, because if the organisation and the leaders, and this is that power dynamics as well, if there is trust, people can work everywhere and anywhere to deliver.
So can I ask Paul? Yeah, Paul's going to have his hand up there to kind of weigh in on this, because it feels to me like we're kind of coming back almost full circle to some of the points you raised at the beginning here around alignment of values and an organisation creating the kind of culture where these sorts of relationships can flourish. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so before I get onto values, just a comment about new ways of working and hybrid. And I think things are going to expand even further. We've sort of got the physical world, which you might consider the old world where we're all in an office. You've got the sort of hybrid world, which is what we're doing now. And we're also starting to talk about the metaverse, which is going to be a completely virtual, world that people can well, I'm not sure all the use cases have been defined yet, but interestingly, I was speaking to a colleague of mine recently who was talking about a client that they were talking to who actually were already making use of the metaverse for meeting. And for them, it helped with their feeling of connectedness because they could actually had an artificial feeling that they were next, physically located next to the people that they were talking with. And also some of the technology that you can have can also change the way that sounds sort of reverberate. So, when the person next to you speaks, they're louder than the person on the other side of the, who are positioned on the other side of the virtual table. So I think looking at technology is a good way of, trying to bridge some of the challenges that we have in hybrid working. So now when we think about values, it does feel like we're going full circle a little bit. When I think about my role and the conversations I have, I think I've seen more refreshed value conversations in clients over the past sort of 6 months to a year than I have maybe in the 10 or 15 years prior. And I think it's tied back to re-emergence. And when you think about the amount of change that has happened during the pandemic, not just for employees, but for organizations themselves. I mean, many of them had to really focus on keeping their business operational with people not being in the office. And that could have, manifested itself in, Nicole mentioned flatter org structures. I've seen organizations where they rally around a problem and build cross-functional teams to try and solve something more quickly. And what's happened through the pandemic, and as we come out of it, organizations are different beasts to how they were as they entered the pandemic. And those changes have either been driven through necessity or, they've led into new strategies because the organization recognizes it has to change the way it operates or goes about doing its business. So how do you take those strategies and how do you implement them and make sure they are successful? You can't just create a strategy and expect the leaders to go and implement them. As I mentioned before, with sustainability, you need your workforce and your employees who are actually going to be the ones that bring your strategy to life, to buy into it and deliver against it. And how do you enable those employees to know how how they should be behaving, or the new ways of working they should be they should be developing. When I look at I was trying to think of an example of where I've seen a disconnect between strategy and leadership. And I remember one client in particular who wanted to change the way their organization worked. They wanted to bust open their siloed approach to working and promote, collaboration and sharing across the entire organization. And they invested a lot of money in collaboration technology. But they came to us about, 9 months later and said, this isn't working. People are not collaborating. And it's because they didn't have a culture of collaboration. At the end of the year, everyone was rated against the person next to them. So where's the incentive to work in a collaborative fashion? And I think that's where values can really play a key role, because when you have a new strategy, you need to also develop a culture that supports that strategy. And that strategy can be brought to life by values, and those values can help employees, essentially be a guide for employees to help them understand how the organization's changed, what the organization holds as their core values and how they want to behave. It can provide a bit of a guide so that employees actually know whether they are demonstrating the right behaviors, where they are living up to the core values. And also it can be helpful for employees and organizations to have a bit of a rethink about whether the values of an employee align with the values of the organization. Because as things change, I as an employee might think, well, actually, I no longer feel that this is an organization that I want to be a part of because its values have changed and they don't align with how I think. And equally, the organization wants to have people in its ranks who actually believe in the strategy, believe in the brand, believe in what that organization is doing, and need the people who are on board with that. And so you may see, as a result of values changing, a shift in workforce. It's actually interesting that there are correlations between even things like belief in brand and financial performance, which may sound a little bit strange, but when you think about it, if you have a workforce that don't believe in the brand, that don't believe that their brand is competitive, that they're doing the right things, you're less inclined to put your maximum effort in. And so when you think about it that way, it's really important to make sure that your values are clear and that your employees understand and believe in them. And if not, make sure that some actions are taken to make sure that alignment is there. Because if you don't, you might find that you struggle to implement your strategy to change the organization in an effective and let's say rapid manner.
Yes, Peter.
So Paul, if I could just follow on from that as a segue, some of the things I've been noticing, and classic resourcefulness type issues that have arisen that I can see people addressing, are the ability to read people online. When you're a change manager in our profession, you're reading a room, you're reading a table. It's very hard to do that online. So how do you do that? There are definitely techniques to do that, and we're all learning that and adding to that the mastery of that, which is some way away, I think, but we're getting there. There's techniques to trust your people working remotely. There are a whole bunch of things that I know organizations are now putting in place who have historically found it difficult to let go and are beginning to start thinking about that. And there's a point to this. There's other ways people are finding to pass on operating protocols and culture that would happen normally face-to-face, which we've all talked about in one way or another, but that's now happening more online. So, I mean, at firms I've worked with, certainly there was a lot of consulting firms, there was a lot of focus on that. And then managing teamwork, or team working dynamics and well-being online. Not easy, but that's something that we have to do. These are all areas that are resourcefulness type issues. And I know some organizations do better than others, but some case-by-case examples that I'd quote just for thought more than anything else. In some oil and gas firms, planned shutdowns are definitely something that they would not consider doing remotely. In many cases, they would say, you've got to come in the office. This is not something we can trust, a remote work. So case-by-case examples definitely drive outcomes. Other people are saying, let's have glue days for projects. So we'll go in 2 days a week, and it'll be this day and that day. So the organization is coming to terms with how to manage this. And these are some of the techniques. There's another one, which is a weekly team day for technology departments, where the CIO can actually, or the CTO can walk around and spread the gospel around the culture and so on. So all of these initiatives, which are compensating for having to work remotely and online, and the new work, the new metaverse, as you put it so eloquently, that's coming, that's impacting. All these techniques are impacting our organizational culture. And perhaps to my earlier point, causing us to start thinking about pivoting a little bit more quickly. One of those areas that are very hard to pivot quickly, which is culture, because it's causing an ongoing rethink on our operating culture. So that's just the points I'd like to make around that.
So that's really interesting, Peter, because I think, if we turn to theme 3 for today's conversation, we've really waded into this area about organizations being truly people first. We've been really looking at the human dynamics of what we're facing and the capabilities that we're all going to need as we move forward and we support our colleagues moving forward. Just briefly to explore this theme in a little bit more detail, Chris, can I ask you to reflect on inauthentic leadership's role and impact on organizations being able to be genuinely people first? So I've seen a question or a comment pop up from the audience around, and how does this work with introverts and extroverts and the different ways in which we interact with our colleagues? How does leadership really impact how psychological safety and people's ability to participate in their workplaces really, what is the dynamic there?
I think that I'll actually use a comment from Michael in the chat. Control versus reward is a very interesting and important dynamic. Is a leader actually saying, I'm going to control and reward you? Or is a leader saying, I'm going to scaffold you? Or does the leader go and say, I'm going to scaffold you, but actually behave differently, which is inauthentic? The moment, and this exists long before we move to this situation, the moment a leader behaves differently to what they say they're going to do, then psychological safety of the people in the organisation is chipped away. The trust of the leader reduces, And if people don't trust the leader, then they can't feel safe in the organisation because they're not sure what the leader might do next. Now we go back to the conversation about organisational value alignment. You have a leader in the organisation saying, people are first, they're really important to us. And then the next thing they do is they go and remove autonomy from the people in the organisation. Of course, we can't trust you to go and do it yourself. What do people do? Well, they actually march with their feet because they say, I can't have a working environment where I don't feel I can trust what's being said to me, where I can feel safe. So we're really at an important point where the leaders showing authenticity within a virtual environment is even tougher because it's harder, as Peter mentioned, it's harder to read people online. Now read them on the screen. Now, are they telling me the truth or not? So the people in organisations are looking more at, well, what's the outcome of the behaviour we're seeing here? And is this an organisation I want to be in, or is this an organisation that I don't want to be in? Now, we also have the issue of extroverts, introverts. Now, the reality is introverts aren't people who like to be alone. Introverts are people who do like to be with other people. They have normal human needs. It's just that that's not what energises them. Whereas extroverts, they get energised by being around people, and some of the introverts find that to be a bit tiring for them. So both introverts and introverts actually both have a similar challenge as far as relationships and trust within this virtual world. Maybe, Paul, you'd like to go and add a bit? No?
Go on, Chris. Yeah.
I was going to say, Paul, maybe you'd like to add a little bit more to that.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how ways of working can also help sort of provide a level playing field. I think organizations are recognizing more and more these days the importance of diversity and inclusion. And some elements of that are obvious, but other elements, such as ways of working, can help provide a level playing field. And I was just in my head comparing two scenarios. One, you imagine a meeting happening in a physical room where you might get an extrovert with the loudest voice. Their voice is the only one that's heard in terms of decision making, versus doing some design thinking sort of ways of working, and even doing that virtually, where the way that is designed, each person, their voice, their thoughts can be contributed in an equal manner. So I do think there's ways that we can think about how we operate and how we interact, and the mechanisms that we use to sort of surface ideas and contributions can help us level that playing field.
Thanks for that, Paul. Now, I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to move us on to our final theme and invite the panelists to expand on their thinking here, because again, when we think about engaging leadership, this is a theme that has emerged in each of the previous focus areas in today's conversation. And I'm going to invite Nicole to reflect on this theme of engaging leadership, and particularly with this idea of expanding our thinking, which is the topic, the overarching topic for today's conversation. From your perspective, Nicole, how do we develop change leaders to deliver the transformations that we need now, and how do we expand what we think about when we say change leadership?
Thanks, Alison. Good question. And I think the key thing here is, again, the change management practices, the program and project practices that we've used in yesteryear are not the same. They're not sustaining what we now need to move forward in the new world. Change management in itself, I think, we're moving away from change management to change leadership. We need effective change leadership. And if I go back to the 4 of my 8 R's, and I know Annie put a comment in there and asked for me to type in the 7, but we probably will end up with 10 or so towards the end of the evening. But if we reflect, reinvent, reimagine, and re-emerge, that is not a linear line. And I think as a change leader, we need to understand that people are going through that reflection, that reinvention, that reimagine or visualization and re-emergence daily, weekly, monthly. They are, their resilience and their rethinking and their resourcefulness Those are critical elements that we need to consider. And the reason why I'm using the R's is it allows us to anchor some of the discussion tonight. And for those of you on the line listening, it really gives you a chance to rethink about this. So the one thing I want to then add to an effective change leader is that you must have a change strategy. You must have the visual and the roadmap of what you're changing. For leaders, it's about the why and the what. Focus on that. Explain the purpose and the connection to the organisation's values. And those values may have been reinvented and reimagined by the leadership as well. Connect the people and the staff and the customers to the cause for the change and for the re-emergence or the reinvention of the organisation. I'm reluctant to use transformation, but I know that Pete Cully and others will use that in a moment. I then want to pick up on words around collaboration, bringing the people together. We don't necessarily need to bring people together in a physical location, exactly what we're talking about. Think about how you can create those virtual situations. We have tools like Miro, you know, we don't need whiteboards and physical post-it notes and Sharpies anymore. We've got Teams and Slack and so many communication tools that we can use where we are sitting in virtual offices. Bring the people together, get the people questioning and co-designing and planning and working together to execute the change. But they've got to believe in the change. They've got to trust, and that credibility needs to be there. So as change leaders, our roles are around that. It's around understanding how our people, our customers are working through that reflection, reinvention, reimagine, reemergence type cycles and worlds. And how do we bring them together to be able to create the team approach that Chris talked about, to be able to have a team as an organisation to deliver a service, deliver multiple services. And I think then if we look at it with change leaders, you've got to be able to see that big picture. You've got to be able to visualize it and link the benefits and the beliefs and the values and the behaviors and support that change. And as a change leader, we need to be resilient. We need to be resourceful, and we always need to be rethinking different approaches and ways of working. So I'm going to hand back to Alison, but I think I've started a little bit of a fire there for Chris and Paul and Peter and Mike to add to as well. Back to you, Alison.
Thanks, Nicole. There's some great gauntlets being thrown there, so we'll briefly see if we can pick up some of those and expand on them. And I'm going to throw another R at Chris, because again, one of the overarching explorations of this conversation series is the issue of resignation versus re-emergence. And obviously we're hearing a lot and seeing a lot about the Great Resignation. Chris, do you think there's a way to expand our thinking about resignation in this context?
That's a good question, Nicole, Alison. Yeah, I think it is, and it's partly what Nicole was talking about was change leadership rather than change management is part of that equation. People focusing on resignation, which is people leaving an organisation and then searching for a new place that they are more comfortable in. Maybe we need to flip the coin and say it's the leaders' roles in organisation to change the organisation so it's a more engaging workplace. It's something where people want to be, they want to stay, somewhere where they feel psychologically safe, somewhere they feel where they feel they can be competent, and they feel they can have meaningful relationships both in the physical and the virtual and even in the metaverse into the future. So leaders need to start thinking about, well, what do we need to do to engage these people so they don't feel the need to go and find somewhere else? So they don't feel the need to go and find, inverted commas, greener pastures. Because I actually fear there's a lot of people who are changing organisations who actually are not going to greener pastures. They're going to the same pasture. It's just with a different fence around it. The real challenge, I think the real moment of truth for leaders right now is how do we design the new workplace? How do we go and create the workplace where our leaders are behaving in a way that is meeting the needs, not of people with hair the colour of mine, but meeting the needs of people who are my children and younger? Because we're talking the millennials are coming through, and the research is clearly showing that their expectations of a workplace is very different. It's why so many of them are comfortable with gig economy as a way of earning their living rather than building careers with organisations. So the challenge for leaders is, what do we need to do to engage a new generation of the workforce? A generation that is coming out of being locked away into working in new ways, and who are the people who are best placed to design that? And I'll be frank with you, it's not the mature leaders of organisations, it's the new generation which is in the best place to create the workplaces of the future.
Thanks for that, Chris. And I'm going to ask Mike, our Digital Brains Trust, to take to the chat to expand on some of these thinkings, particularly around the digital technologies and how leaders can use that in their engagement activities. Paul, can I ask you to build on what you've heard from Nicole and Chris so far?
Yeah, I completely agree with both what Nicole and Chris said, and just building on one of Chris's final comments, where he talked about having new leaders. It's interesting when you look back over time and what might have meant, you know, the characteristics of a good leader prior to the pandemic versus post-pandemic. You know, there's such amount of change that happened during the pandemic that, you know, you don't necessarily, especially when you're a big organization who previously maybe had relied on someone who'd been, you know, many years in the industry, knew how the business operated inside out. You know, you wanted a steady hand that could guide a big oil tanker. Well, actually that oil tanker really had to try and change course quite quickly, and that required a whole heap of new skills. So while there's some, you know, core, you know, leadership characteristics like integrity and honesty that need to be there, I think there is more of an emphasis on some different types of leadership characteristics. And interestingly, I think a lot of them are around people. So, you know, I think when you think about rapid change, there needs to be some level of delegation of decision making and having the trust in your people to be able to make the right decisions and allowing them to make the right decisions. To Chris's point about allowing them to be competent. I think it's also important that leaders these days are really good listeners. I think if you think about the amount of knowledge that's in an organization, if you are not able to harness it, then it's a detriment to your own, you know, growth and pivot. There's a great example around being good listening. If you look at just how the Microsoft organizations changed over many years, they've gone from being considered they would consider themselves as know-it-alls, and certainly in the new organization, they consider themselves as learn-it-alls. And it's had a real change in the way that business has operated, and it's been really, really critical in how they've evolved. I think leaders need to also have a real emotional intelligence. I think gone are the days where you can just lead from an ivory tower somewhere. You really need to have connection with your employees, and as part of that, communications feeds into that as well. I mean, I could go on. There's so many more. You know, an innovative mindset. You know, being able to you know, feel comfortable with change and even, you know, help the organization and employees sort of fit into an operating model that assumes change is permanent. You know, that I think in itself is a really key sort of trait. I mentioned earlier on about, you know, strategies are strategies. You need your people. You need to be able to lead your people and help them execute against it. So I might take a pause there before I start rattling off with a 10 or 12.
Thanks for that, Paul. And it's interesting listening to you there that, you know, the R for reflectiveness and reflection comes to mind, which is timely for me to now turn to Peter and ask you to reflect on what you've heard from your colleagues to bring us in for a landing.
Yeah, thank you, Alison. Just in the interest of time, I'll keep this as short as possible. But, you know, the tone from the top is absolutely critical. As we all know, you know, leaders set that framework, the operating in behavioral boundaries for their people to follow. So leadership in a virtual world is absolutely critical. I keep thinking back to how many change managers are in the C-suite of organizations. Not many. Not many have made it up there. Isn't that interesting? And we're in the game where we ought to be considered very seriously at that level. So what is it that's missing in those leaders? Perhaps looking at things more broadly around mental health and well-being, risk management, diversity. We've talked about these tonight, diversity and inclusion, business transformation, UX, CX, agile, org agility, the use of SIPOC workshops within a change management, change impact assessment. All these connections are there to be seen. And I think if an org design culture, there's all areas I think we need to consider as change people in organizations. And I'm coming to the point, Nicole, I love the way you put that in terms of the leaders answering the why and what questions, absolutely spot on. But change management for me isn't enough. It's about effective transformation, which requires a thinking around those broad areas. And I think that's what's going to make the leaders from the change community in the future. So it is a broader scope. The leaders will try to manage this, but they'll need to set the tone and the culture of the place. I agree with Chris in terms of working in organizations that people want to belong to, where they realize their interests, they grow their careers, they work with and greet and meet great colleagues, and both have fun professionally and personally. There are all things that tie in. We're just saying the same thing in different ways, but leaders are critical to this, and the virtual world is just more complex. But I think there are ways to address that. Part of that is thinking more broadly around these broader topics in delivering effective transformation, ROI, and benefits for organizations, which is what they're after. After all, they pay us the money to bring us to work to have these conversations. So let's give them cut them a bit of slack and say, yeah, there's two sides to this. It's not all just about resignation, re-emergence, and us, the individual, telling people what to do. There's very much a two-way street here. And I'd like to engage that conversation perhaps in our final version of this topic in November.
Thank you so much, Peter. Well said. So I'd like to thank our panel for sharing their deep experience, their thinking, and their provocations with us today. And a special shout out to Mike Kirch, who's been overcoming the irony of digital challenges by answering and engaging in digital conversation in the chat. So after many questions in the last hour, my closing question is to you, our viewers. After listening to today's discussion, how can you disrupt your practice to lead and support the change that's really needed? Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you found it challenging, stimulating, perhaps a little uncomfortable. That's what it's meant to do. We look forward to seeing you for the final installment of the series in November, when we'll be focusing on empowerment. Until then, bye for now.